Is there a scene in the Lord of the Rings trilogy that makes you go, really? Even for mega fans of the movies, it's inevitable that you have one or two moments which make you blink a few times with a nerdy, "that's not lore accurate" type of expression. For me, the epitome of this feeling is easy to pinpoint, as it actually happens during two back-to-back scenes in the Two Towers. And both moments incorporate our beloved hobbits, as we see Sam and Frodo at the Black Gate and Merry and Pippin at Treebeard's home. For some of you, even me mentioning those scenes will give you an idea of where I'm heading with this, but for others, you probably are completely unaware of these massive flaws in Jackson's adaptation. Honestly though, regardless of whichever camp you fall into, I guarantee that you don't know the full scope of these scenes' transgressions. Everything from absolutely absurd moments of stealth to copying hobbit-eating trees from previous books, Jackson does it all. Plus, because of these deviations, we miss out on another moment of Frodo revealing his authority and power through the ring. So in this video, I'm going to unpack all these scenes fully and list out all the differences between the book and the movie version. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 26 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Lord of the Rings edition. As you might have guessed, this is the show where I take Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings adaptations and compare them to Tolkien's original lore to find every single difference along the way. Today, we're going to dive into Treebeard, Frodo and Sam's perhaps most unrealistic moment, and Old Man Willow's cameo. But first, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter. Each week, I highlight one of my favorite comments from a previous episode, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. And of course, make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, so you can stay up to date with the series as it continues. We're already through the Fellowship of the Ring, so check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you've missed so far. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But before we head into the changes, let's recap what happened during these scenes in the movie. Picking up from where we left off last week, we cut to Frodo, Sam, and Gollum scaling some rocks to get a good view of the Black Gate of Mordor. Suddenly, they hear horns blow as the gate opens to let in some evil men who are allied with the enemy. Sam then gets too close to the edge and falls down the cliffside, and Frodo rushes after him but struggles to get him out of the gravel he was buried in during the fall. Due to the mini landslide that Sam caused, some of the evil men begin walking toward their direction to see what's going on. Frodo realizes that he can't get Sam out, and as a last-ditch effort, covers them both using his Lothlorien cloak. Thankfully, this does the trick, and the men can't see them as the cloak simply looks like a rock to their eyes. After the men walk off, Frodo quickly gets Sam out of the ground and they hide again. Realizing that they only have a split second to run for the open gate as it might not open again, Frodo and Sam prepare to make a mad dash for it, but unfortunately for them, Gollum yanks them back and keeps them from heading into Mordor. He cries out that they can't go in through that way and says that he knows another way. Reluctantly, as the gate closes again, Frodo agrees to have Gollum take them through the other path, and they depart. Then the movie cuts to our other two hobbits, as we see Merry waking up on the forest floor and looking around. They're in Treebeard's home, and Pippin is over by a natural spring drinking some of the water. Merry walks up to him, and after Pippin belches, Merry realizes that he said something in tree-ish. Pippin denies it, but Merry presses the subject as he feels something isn't right. He then realizes that Pippin is taller than him and is slowly hiding the water bowl he's drinking from, and Merry lunges forward to take it. He drinks some of it, but Pippin chases him around, saying that Treebeard said he couldn't have any. Eventually, they chase each other into the roots of a large tree nearby, and the roots grab hold of their ankles, causing them to fall and slowly get eaten up by the tree. After fully disappearing, Treebeard walks into frame and reprimands the tree, telling it to let the hobbits go and to go to sleep. Thankfully, the tree relinquishes the halflings, and then we cut to Merry and Pippin being carried by Treebeard as he walks with them toward the next destination. After we hear Treebeard say that they lost the Entwives, Pippin asks how they died. Treebeard then says they didn't die, but they lost them, much to the confusion of the hobbits. Finally, Treebeard asks Merry and Pippin if they've seen any Entwives, and sadly they say no, but Pippin asks what they look like. Treebeard then tells him that he can't remember what they look like, and that is where the scene ends. By the way, for those of you who are super confused right now, that scene is in the extended edition only, but that's the version I use for the series as I want to make sure that I don't leave anything out. Now before we jump into the plot changes, let's first cover our categories of characters, timeline, and location. To start, our character changes are a little too complex to get into right now. What I mean by that is essentially in both scenes we get mini history lessons, one from Gollum and one from Treebeard. During their monologues in the book, they rattle off many old characters that you would recognize from Middle-earth history. I can't get into them now as there's too many to name off, and they really don't relate to these scenes specifically. I just wanted to mention that we miss out on that background lore in the movie. For location, we get a pass this week as both scenes are accurately at the Black Gate and then Treebeard's home. But when it comes to timeline, we do have a difference, which is that the scene with Frodo, Sam, and Gollum actually took place over an entire day. Of course, to condense things for the movie, they show this interaction lasting only about 5 minutes. However, Tolkien has a whole chapter dedicated to this day they spend observing the Black Gate. Of course, we'll cover the details of that day coming up here in the plot changes, but first I wanted to clarify something. Typically at this point I would say that I can't go over the dialogue in detail, but this week is a little different as many of the changes pertain to conversations between Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, and then Treebeard, Merry, and Pippin. If I skipped over dialogue this week, the video would be about 3 minutes long, plus the integrity of the series would have been compromised as I would have skipped so many crucial changes. And like I said, this week's scenes are two of the most difficult for me to cover, especially due to these narrative deviations. That being said, I can't go word for word through things, so if you're wanting to relive this story in a whole new way, check out my link in the description to claim your free trial of Audible, which will get you 1 free audiobook. That way you can support the channel and hear all the dialogue for yourself. Alright, let's dive into the changes. Let's start things off by going over this first scene with Frodo, Sam, and Gollum coming upon the Black Gate. Like I mentioned in the timeline section, this whole interaction takes place over an entire day, whereas the movie keeps it to a few minutes. For the most part, they do a good job not leaving stuff out, but rather paraphrasing what Tolkien wrote. However, even with it being very similar, it isn't perfect, and there's one major difference which I'm sure all of you have been waiting for. Of course, I'm talking about Sam falling and Frodo protecting him with a Lothlorien cloak. In the book, this never happens. Sam doesn't fall, and there's no point at which they use their cloaks during this chapter. We're already getting off to a hot start here because this is one of the key things that rubs me the wrong way just from a film perspective. As you know, when I do this series, I make it clear that I love both the movies and the books, and when I present the differences, I try to give my analysis without being toxic about anything because I genuinely do love both. But let's look at today as my proverbial cheat day when it comes to being opinionated, because I have a lot of thoughts on these scenes. When watching this scene, I always think, how did those men not see them when Frodo was trying to dig Sam up? Frodo obviously knew they were coming, so it just doesn't make sense. Plus, how in the world did Sam get buried that deep? And if he did, trust me, it would have been nearly impossible for him to get out, let alone the fact that he probably would have had multiple broken bones from the weight of the rocks compacting around his body. But as we see in the movie, right after the soldiers leave, Frodo gets him out in a half a second. All in all, more than just not being lore accurate, it just doesn't make sense from a film perspective. And one of the things that I like about Peter Jackson's adaptations overall is the realism in a fantasy story. So this scene just throws me off. Anyway, this moment plays into another change, which is that since Sam never falls, Frodo doesn't try to make a break for it before the Black Gate closes. Gollum does insist that he not go through the gate, just like in the movie, but there's no physical struggle of Gollum literally yanking them back and not letting them go forward. Now, besides those obvious plot deviations, there are a few minor omissions on the dialogue side that I wanted to mention. To make things easier, let's just go in order of the chapter. To start, they arrive at the Black Gate right at the break of dawn. Sam makes some comments about his gaffer, kinda like what we get in the movie, but then they go straight into Gollum talking about another path into Mordor. Gollum says that they mustn't go through the Black Gate, and explains that he knows another way. Sam asks why he hasn't mentioned that before, and Gollum says that Master didn't ask. So far, pretty similar to the movie, but where it starts to deviate is when Frodo and Gollum come to a resolution within a minute or two in the movie version. In the book, Gollum is very reluctant to share information about this alternative path, as it almost pains him to talk about it. Frodo and Sam theorize that he potentially was released through this path and then told to find the ring and then bring the ring bearer through that way. Ultimately, it takes a while before they get the full info out of Gollum. He shares not only about the stairs and the tunnel, but also gives them a mini history lesson about Gondor and men and tales he heard when he was a child, which by the way would have been hundreds of years ago. Finally, after hearing about the path, Frodo takes a few hours to think about the options. While they're waiting for Frodo to make a decision, Sam thinks to himself that they definitely shouldn't go that way, and I guess you could mark that down as another slight difference. You see, in the movie, they make Sam very vocal about his opposition to Gollum, but in the book, he keeps these thoughts in his own head as he respects Frodo's wisdom and will follow him anywhere. Also, you gotta remember that in the book version, Sam had overheard Gollum a few nights before plotting the murder of the hobbits, so in the book, Sam has a lot more of a reason to not trust Gollum, but he still keeps it to himself. This is probably indicative of Frodo and Sam's relationship, as Sam sees himself as greatly inferior to his master and doesn't speak up as much as his movie counterpart. Another key bit of dialogue which was left out completely and not even paraphrased was Frodo's threat to Gollum about the ring. For the most part, Gollum seems to think that Frodo is a pushover at this point. Sam thinks so as well, even making note in his head that his master is too kind to Gollum. However, we get to a crucial piece of dialogue which has Frodo tell Gollum that he must remember his oath he made by the Precious. Frodo says that the Precious will hold him to his word, and then threateningly tells him that Gollum has to obey the Precious. He says that if he were to wear the ring and tell Gollum to cast himself into fire or leap from a cliff, then Gollum would have to do so. This is a dark bit of conversation in which our dear Frodo once again takes on the ominous power of the ring and commands Gollum. Tolkien then writes that this almost snaps Gollum out of it and reminds him that Frodo won't be so easy to trick. Finally, the last part of the chapter contains an unfortunate omission, which Jackson translated to a later scene. We'll cover it more once we get there, but it's worth mentioning now as technically it takes place while they're at the Black Gate. While Frodo is thinking about his decision, they see winged creatures flying overhead. They speculate that they're ring wraiths riding fell beasts just like they had seen in the marshes before, but they can't be sure. Shortly after the winged creatures disappear, they hear the singing and shouting of men, and then see a host of men marching towards the Black Gate. Frodo recalls seeing the same image while on the High Seat of Seeing at Amon Hen, but he had thought this vision was of the men of Gondor marching to take on Mordor. To his dismay, he realizes that it's actually allies of Mordor coming to their aid. These men they see in the book match the description of the men we later see with the Oliphants in the movie. However, that is where our omission lies. Not so much in men marching to Mordor, because that is shown in this scene, but rather Sam's inquiry about Oliphants. You see, as Gollum tells them what he's seen, Sam asks him if he sees an Oliphant, and Gollum says that he doesn't know what that is. Sam then gets up, puts his hand behind his back, as he does whenever he recites poetry, and then starts a poem about Oliphants. He then asks Gollum again, now that Gollum has a clear description of the creature, and Gollum once again says that he doesn't see any, much to Sam's disappointment. It is then right after this moment of light-hearted poetry that Frodo makes his decision and tells Gollum to lead them through the stairs and tunnel. Frodo also makes a funny remark after this, saying that he wishes they had 1,000 Oliphants, with Gandalf riding a white one at the front to lead the charge into Mordor. I thought this was a nice moment in the book, as it showcases Sam's relentless ability to keep lighthearted and hopeful, even in the darkest moments. But I agree, it wouldn't have been fitting for this scene. Anyway, now that we've covered all our changes for this scene at the Black Gate, we cut to Merry and Pippin waking up in Treebeard's home, and trust me, there are plenty more changes to discuss here. I like covering these two scenes together as it really shows us the differences between our sets of hobbits and their respective parts that they play in the overall story. Frodo and Sam with Gollum at the Black Gate, and Merry and Pippin with Treebeard. Two very different trios who are going to serve two very different purposes. But this scene, which showcases Merry and Pippin drinking Ent Draft and then getting stuck in a tree, is a massive change from the book for multiple reasons. If you've been watching my series all the way through, we've had to do some skipping around to keep up with Jackson's version. In Tolkien's writings, he takes up an entire chapter, one of the largest in the whole book, to talk about Merry and Pippin meeting Treebeard, going to his home, talking with him about the Ents in the forest, and then ending with them meeting for Entmoot. It's an expansive chapter, and we've already covered their meeting with Treebeard in a previous episode. Plus, in the last episode, I briefly mentioned how they aren't asleep when they get to Treebeard's home. In last week's episode, the scene was so short that I didn't want to spend 10 minutes talking about Treebeard's role, but today, since half of these scenes are Merry and Pippin with Treebeard, I think it's worth expanding upon. To give you a bit of a roadmap for what we're going to discuss today, here's the general outline of Tolkien's version. Picking up from Merry and Pippin meeting with Treebeard, there's a bit of dialogue as they walk to Treebeard's home. Then, once they're at Treebeard's home, we have conversation between the three characters that lasts for quite a while. Afterwards, they go to sleep and then wake up and prepare for Entmoot. We'll be following that same roadmap to cover these changes, so buckle up. First, let's address their conversation while they're heading to Treebeard's home, as Jackson completely omits it from this film. And this conversation centers around one question Pippin has for Treebeard. Why did Celeborn warn the Fellowship to stay away from Fangorn? As Treebeard continues his long strides towards his home, he goes on a long monologue about the forest and Celeborn's assumption of its danger. He begins by saying that he might have said the same thing about Lothlorien, saying how strangers typically don't make it out of there. But eventually he does tell them that Fangorn Forest is also a strange and dangerous place, especially at this point in time. He tells Merry and Pippin about how some trees are going entish, which is to say that they're becoming more aware, and he also says that some ents are going tree-ish, which means they're falling asleep. This means that a larger number of trees are going unchecked and untamed in the wild. Merry then compares these trees, with bad hearts as Treebeard says, to the willow they encountered in the Old Forest, and Treebeard says that it's much worse than the Old Forest. He continues to discuss the great darkness that is growing, but eventually goes into a low murmuring chant of sorts like a poem or a song. By the way, this conversation is a lot longer than I covered here, and is once again a prime example of why you should read the book for yourself if you want a more detailed refresher. But before I move on, I should mention that Peter Jackson does have a slight parallel to this, as he shows Merry and Pippin talking to Treebeard as they head to Entmoot. The key difference is, first, they have this conversation as they walk to Treebeard's home, not Entmoot. And second, the conversation is much longer in the book. Next, as we follow the chapter roadmap I laid out earlier, we arrive at Treebeard's home. In the last episode, I already mentioned the difference of their sleeping arrangement, so I won't repeat that again. But the key difference here is the omission of their time spent with Treebeard before they go to sleep. Here's what happens in the book. After arriving in Treebeard's home, the Ent grabbed 2 large vessels which were filled with water and held his hands over them. Immediately, they began to glow, 1 gold and 1 green. Treebeard then invited the hobbits to sit on his massive stone table. As he said, Ent homes don't have chairs. Then he gave the hobbits bowls filled with the water from the 2 vessels he had just put his hands over. After everyone had their fill of drink, Treebeard had Merry and Pippin finally recount their full tale to him, as so far he still hadn't heard it. When they brought up the Shire, Treebeard stopped them to ask if they had seen any Entwives. Pippin then asked if Entwives looked like Ents, and Treebeard said that he didn't remember, but tells them that Entwives would have liked the Shire based on Merry and Pippin's description of it. Small aside here is that in this scene of the movie, we do actually have a bit of that portion of the dialogue, as Pippin does ask Treebeard what the Entwives look like, and Treebeard does say that he doesn't remember. Anyway, continuing with the book, Merry and Pippin then continued their tale, and Treebeard was especially intrigued to hear about everything to do with Gandalf. After they finished their tale, Treebeard says that they haven't told him everything, but that is probably what Gandalf would have wanted. The hobbits then ask Treebeard what he will do about this news the hobbits bring, and he says that he is not on anybody's side, but then mentions something very interesting. Because Merry and Pippin had brought up the Uruk-hai who had captured them and told Treebeard that they were under orders from Saruman, Treebeard seemed to focus on that. He told Merry and Pippin that Saruman is a neighbor, and that recently he has thought about doing something about Saruman's growing power. He talks for a while about this point and fills Merry and Pippin in on who Saruman is, how he came to Middle-earth, and what he's currently up to. He tells them that Saruman has a mind of metal now and is focused on becoming a power in Middle-earth. Treebeard says that he sees smoke rising from Isengard, and many of the trees they cut down were his friends, who he had known from Nut and Acorn. Sound familiar? Peter Jackson used a lot of this dialogue later on in the film to fit his own version of events, which is extremely different. Of course, we'll cover those scenes once we get there, but for now, just know that it is actually in Treebeard's home that they have this conversation. Plus, Treebeard is very aware of Saruman's treachery. He even ends things off by saying that he has gotten too hasty and must cool himself off, as thinking about Saruman has gotten him too hot-headed. Now, before we get to Old Man Willow and the Ent draft scene, we have one more bit of conversation, which actually relates to the moment in the movie of Pippin asking about the Entwives. As I already mentioned before, Treebeard briefly mentioned Entwives in the previous bit of dialogue, but the biggest change we have now is that Pippin brings back up the Entwives and asks Treebeard to recount the full tale of who they are and what happened to them. In the movie, Treebeard simply says that they were lost and seems forgetful about the whole thing. Although he is somewhat forgetful in the book, he actually gives them a pretty detailed historical account of what happened in the Ents' history. We learn things like how the Entwives loved plenty and peace and made gardens to dwell in around Middle-earth, how the Entwives crossed the Great River and left the Ents to live in their gardens, but how eventually when Treebeard and the other Ents went searching for them, they found only desert, which now the men of the land call the Brown Lands. He tells the hobbits how Sauron had destroyed all their gardens during the war, and the Entwives seem to have disappeared. Okay, so now let's head into our final part of these pages in the chapter, which I outlined earlier, and discuss Merry and Pippin waking up in Treebeard's home. Both of these final differences are really what bother me when I watch this movie. Honestly, if you just watch the films, it's not so bad, but when you know the truth behind Tolkien's lore, you really start to wonder why these scenes were there. Like I said earlier, Peter Jackson must have had a similar thought, as these moments are saved for the extended edition only. Anyway, the first change is quite simple, and one that you might have already realized based on the previous conversations and changes. Merry and Pippin don't fight over drinking the Ent draft. In the book, it does say that the drink Treebeard gave them the next morning tasted different from the one they had the night before, and that it felt like there was something going from their toes all the way up to the top of their heads, even making their hair stand up after the drink. But what we see in the movie with them chasing each other around never happens. Plus, something we learn at the very end of the book when the hobbits return to the Shire is that Merry and Pippin were a couple inches taller each, making them both the tallest hobbits in the Shire. So the Ent draft did make them grow, but it was never a situation like what the movie shows. They never fought over it, and Pippin never shrank back to his normal size like what Jackson shows later after they take Isengard. And this segues us perfectly into the final change, which is probably one of the most commented things on my channel, and that is that a tree never eats them at this point in the book. Let me repeat, at this point in the book. That's right, Peter Jackson didn't just make this up, but created the scene as a way to pay homage to the Hobbit's earlier journey through the Old Forest in the Fellowship of the Ring. This tree in this scene is none other than Old Man Willow, at least Jackson's version of him. If you recall from their journey into the Old Forest, early on in the Fellowship of the Ring, Merry and Pippin get sleepy and lay up against a tree, which consumes them, and Frodo and Sam have to figure out how to get them out. Well, things don't go so well, and they have to eventually call for help. Thankfully, Tom Bombadil happens to come along right at that moment and tells Old Man Willow to let them go. Fun fact, Treebeard's lines to the tree in this scene are actually taken from what Tom Bombadil says to Old Man Willow in the Old Forest chapter. But considering that Jackson completely removed those chapters and the character of Tom Bombadil, they were easily able to steal those lines and give them to Treebeard. If you want to learn more about those chapters, which Jackson completely removed from the Fellowship of the Ring film, check out my episode about Tom Bombadil in this series. Anyway, that wraps up the changes for this week. And after all that, I'm feeling a bit exhausted. I mean, first off, we've got a scene that is off the charts on the unrealistic graph, and then we have a moment with Merry and Pippin that is just a horribly paraphrased version of the true story. I kinda wish they would have kept the Ent draft moment from the book and acknowledged that both Merry and Pippin had gotten taller because of it. But hey, that's just me. After all my opinions today, I don't want to hear my own voice anymore this week. So what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and be sure to check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you've missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.